And before we get started, Tim, do you have any announcements we need to make? Unmute first, Tim.
If you buy a brick, that was my big announcement. Everything going well, and appreciate everybody's leaning in. The contributions for the capital campaign or pledges for over 600,000, and we've continued to have great support for our regular donations. So it makes you humble for the community we belong to. But all's good, and everybody take care.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Tim. Now, we're all gathered here to listen to Don Keith. Let me read his bio first. Award-winning and best-selling author Don Keith has published more than 36 books, fiction, nonfiction, and biographies, including several national bestsellers. As a broadcast journalist, he won awards from the Associated Press, United Press International for news writing and reporting, and was also the first winner of the Troy University Hector Award for innovation in broadcast journalism. As an on-the-air broadcaster, Don has twice won the Billboard Magazine Radio Personality of the Year. He's also a best-selling submarine thriller author, co-authored with me, and which was the basis for Hunter Killer, which we've all talked about. He wrote Ice Diaries, the story of one of mankind's greatest adventures, which Don co-authored with Captain William Anderson, which was nominated for a Pulitzer. Don is one of the most prolific authors of submarine history, currently writing with several books on World War II submarines, in addition to Ice Diaries. Don's writing has also appeared in such publications as the Washington Post, CQ Magazine, the American Legion Magazine, K9Y Telegraph, and the Irish Times. He has appeared on scores of documentaries and TV shows from Fox Nation to C-SPAN Book TV. He has also written several movie scripts and has projects in various stages of pre-production for movies and television. His documentary film, Colors of Character, was recently released in selected theaters nationwide. Among other topics, Don has written extensively about World War II history. He sponsors the Untold Millions Project, an effort to encourage the capture and archiving of eyewitness accounts of major historical events. Project website is www.untoldmillions.net. And without further ado, Don, we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, George. Yeah, as George mentioned, I've been fortunate enough to have dumb publishers pay me money to publish my books. The 36th, 37th, and 38th will be out next year. I may not be good, but I'm prolific. As I always say, I'm going to keep writing until somebody buys one. Let's try this and see if it works. Host is disabling participant screen sharing. So Mr. Host, if you could allow me to share the screen. I don't know how you do that exactly. I know some of you are probably in a hurry. You got to go out and shovel the driveway or see if you can find your car in the driveway. You've had a nor'easter. We had a few snow flurries down here in Alabama last week, and that sent everybody running to the grocery store for the essentials. Anytime it snows in Alabama, that's bread, milk, and single malt scotch. But today we're in the high 40s, which is kind of unusual for us. Try it again. Yeah, it's going to let me share.
Tim, you got to make him the host. Tim?
Tim Oliver.
Tim?
Is that how it works?
Yeah, Tim.
I can share here.
Can't hear. There it is.
There you go. That's working now.
There it is.
It'll actually let me go into slideshow mode. We can proceed with this thing. You know, it's great to talk to you folks today. It's good to meet you all. I think George is the only one I've seen so far that I know. I have been fortunate to know quite a few submariners and to tell their stories. And when it gets right down to it, that's what I am, as a storyteller. About, I guess, 14 years ago, I got a phone call one day, and the fellow said, Don Keith, yes. This is Captain William Anderson. What you doing right now? Well, I'm sitting here in my chair talking to you on the phone, Captain. No, I mean, what sort of project are you involved in right now? I told him I was about to start a new book, and he said, well, stop. I've got a project for you. You don't say no to Captain Bill Anderson. And he asked me if I would help him tell the full story of his voyage to the North Pole and what happened with Nautilus. The captain had actually done a very good bestseller way back in the year after the Nautilus made the run to the North Pole. But at that time, there were a lot of background information that he did not know, that he was not aware of. Plus, so much of it was classified, he was not able to talk about that. And he had dreamed for years of going ahead and doing a second book that would tell much of the background information, what really brought the voyage of Nautilus to the forefront, why it was such a big deal, and how they almost didn't make it, not once and not twice, but 3 times. Of course, I agreed to do it. Got to spend some time with Captain Anderson up in Leesburg, Virginia, and his wife, Pat. And it was one of the great experiences of my life. Bill he was absolutely one of the great gentlemen. He told the story when he grew up in Tennessee. It's always been remarkable to me how many of you submariners grew up a long, long way from the ocean. He grew up in Middle Tennessee. When all the other kids would be out on the lake swimming or boating, he would turn the boat over and get under the boat because he wanted to be a submariner, even that early in his career. And Captain Anderson was a hero long before Nautilus came along. He made 11, count them, 11 World War II war patrols, and that's truly amazing. Go back to 1955, 56, 57. That slide says mid-1960s. I guess we probably needed heroes in mid-1960s, but that's incorrect. We're going to talk about the mid-1950s. America was pretty much over the euphoria of beating the Hun and beating the Japanese in World War II. That euphoria was waning. It was helped in great part by the non-war in Korea, a conflict in which there still is no real closure, even all these years afterwards. And the Russians, the Cold War was in full force even in the early 50s. Russians were rattling that nuclear saber, as we all know, and as you all know. They were developing their own nuclear program. They really weren't caring how many people they killed in the process, as long as they could try to get ahead of the U.S. and what was happening. Other things going on in society, the country was finally coming face to face with racial discrimination. The civil rights movement was just getting cranked up. It was a time of, as Jimmy Carter said, another former submariner, whether you acknowledge him or not, Jimmy Carter talked about the great malaise. Well, there certainly was a great malaise in the mid-1950s in this country. One of the big things that led to that was our space program was literally blowing up on live television on the launch pad down at Cape Canaveral. After several rockets fell over and blew up, the Russians came along and launched Sputnik. And for the first time in at least modern times, a lot of the world was starting to wonder if they were lining up with the wrong superpower, if the United States technologically was losing ground to the Soviets. Speaking of Sputnik, I can remember it very well. My dad was a television repairman here in Alabama. He had a little shop out back, and he had a shortwave receiver that he would listen to while he was working on televisions and radios. He listened to Radio Moscow, he listened to Radio Havana, and he called me out one day and he said, "Don, I want you to hear this." And it was just a monotonous sound. I said, "Well, that's not very impressive. What is that?" He said, "That's Sputnik. That's a Russian satellite that's now launched and is going over our heads at this very moment." And scared me to death. I was, 47 to Sputnik. I was 10 years old. I couldn't imagine that the Russians were able to launch something and put it up over our heads like that. And you know what? Neither could Dwight Eisenhower. He was livid. He kept calling in his advisors and asking what the U.S. could do to show the world that we had not lost that technological advantage that came with capitalism and a free democracy. While the Russians with communism and socialism were apparently getting ahead of us, they had some ideas. We had made a few breakthroughs in cancer research and that sort of thing, but nothing real sexy. So he sent his guys out to see if they could find out what in the world we could do to show the world that we had not lost the technological advantage. Well, we had it under our nose all the time. It was called USS Nautilus, SSN 571. Nautilus had been launched on January 21st, 1954. The lady breaking the champagne bottle there on the bow is Mamie Eisenhower. Interesting story there. The day before the launch of Nautilus, the Washington Post ran a story saying that Nautilus was simply an experimental vessel and not a warship, that she didn't even have torpedo tubes. And Eisenhower said, you've asked my wife to come launch an experimental vessel when she should be launching a warship. Had to be explained to them that, first of all, yes, it was experimental, but she did have 6 torpedo tubes, so she was a warship, and that she was going to change, she, not Mamie Eisenhower, but she, the Nautilus, was going to change the face of naval warfare from now on, and convinced him to let her go ahead and break that bottle of champagne on there. So she was launched in January 1954, commissioned September 30th of 1954 with Commander Eugene Wilkinson as the plank owner and the commissioning skipper. You all know about Hyman Rickover. You know a lot more about that. That's one of the funny things about doing this little talk today. I'm NQP. I was not in the service. I have only been in a very few submarines. I think sometimes I could qualify on an old diesel boat if you'll give me a couple of weeks, because I've written so much about them. But I know I couldn't qualify on a nuke boat. But I had an occasion on the 50th anniversary of Nautilus to the North Pole to give a presentation at the Submarine Force Museum in Groton. And I'm sitting there doing my little spiel, and I look up and there are 7 guys on the back row who made the voyage. And I thought, oh man, am I in deep trouble. Fortunately, at the end of the presentation, they did come down and said, Don, you did a good job. Thank you. And I appreciate that very much. Hyman Rickover and Bill Anderson there on the right. Bill talked a lot about the interview process. I know probably some of the folks on this call have gone through that same process with Rickover. But Bill came down to DC, and when he got there, he was told that the Admiral didn't have time to see him that day, to go away and come back the next day. He didn't know if that was true or not. He told him to come back the next day at 2 o'clock. Bill shows up at the Admiral's office at 8 o'clock the next morning. He sits there until 2 o'clock, finally gets ushered into Rickover's office. Rickover's on the phone, and he motions for Bill to sit down. As soon as the Admiral hangs up the telephone, he looks Bill straight in the eye and he says, okay, Anderson, name me the last 10 books you read, who the authors were, and give me a brief synopsis of each book. How many of us could do that? Well, Bill read all the time. He couldn't think of a single one. He went back home, back up to Groton, where he was an instructor in the sub school. And he talked to his wife at that time, and she said, maybe he really wants to know. Why don't you write it up and send it down to him and see what happens? He did. Didn't hear anything for 2 months. Then he finally gets the call to come down. The Admiral wants him to work for him. Bill was of the opinion, I call him Bill, that's a very familiar term for somebody of his stature, but Bill was of the opinion that Admiral Rickover was looking at him as a potential CO of Nautilus. In this case, it was the second skipper. He believes that Rickover was convinced that the first captain was great at PR, that Bill would be much better at practical application of this amazing war machine that they were commissioning and putting to sea. The first time that the attempt was made to go to the North Pole actually happened in the summer of 1957, not long after Bill took the helm of Nautilus. They were supposed to be on their way to the North Sea for NATO exercises and to demonstrate the capability of a nuclear submarine, since this was the only one that existed, serial number 1. On the way, Bill had talked the Navy into allowing him to go under the ice, which, as we all know, the Germans spent a lot of time under the ice, but not very far. We actually had no idea what the sea was like, what the sea ice was like. How deep did it go? How far did it go? How dangerous was it? could you make it all the way to the North Pole under the polar ice pack? Bill had talked the Navy into allowing them to make at least a penetration, and he got very vague orders that he could proceed beyond a certain latitude if prudent. Well, they got under the ice pretty deeply, and Bill decided to go ahead and see how far he could go. Could he make it to the North Pole? The number one problem, besides not knowing what it was like under the ice, was navigation, of course. As you get closer and closer to the magnetic North Pole, your compasses are less and less accurate, and they proceeded to get themselves lost. They thought they found a hole in the ice. Nautilus did not have the capability of punching a hole in any kind of ice because the sail just wasn't built for it. They tried to surface, and they did hit an ice keel and did severe damage to the periscope. That periscope damage threatened their primary mission, which was to take part in that NATO exercise. But in the middle of a gale with almost zero temperature, once they got out from beneath the ice, those guys were able to rig a welding equipment and weld the periscope back, pull a vacuum on the scope so they didn't have the fogging problem, and they were able to go ahead and go to the North Sea and conduct that exercise. It was a year later before anybody even really got word of what happened. We sank the entire British Navy with Nautilus at that particular exercise. Nobody knew how to react to a vessel that had that sort of capability. After this all happened, and Bill was greatly relieved. I mean, he had taken a risk, not necessarily a very prudent risk, and he worried a lot about what the ramifications might be. But when he got back to D.C., he had a chance meeting with President Eisenhower's naval attaché. That was Pete Durand. Pete was just asking him what was going on, what had he been up to, had he done anything unusual with Nautilus, and Bill shared the attempt to go to the North Pole. And he also shared the opinion that he thought it was not only possible, but that it could be earth-shaking if he could take Nautilus to the North Pole, not only for the military aspect of it, but to learn the nature of that polar ice and the ocean beneath the polar ice, that it would have tremendous science and technological results. Well, Pete Durand went right straight to President Eisenhower and told him about what Nautilus could do. And here's Eisenhower trying to find something pretty dramatic that he could do with to show the Russians that we had not lost our technological edge, even as the rockets continued to blow up down at Cape Canaveral. But he says, do it. Take Nautilus to the North Pole. And that's exactly what Bill said about doing. The first real attempt, I really count the on the way to the NATO exercise as a semi-attempt. The first real attempt, the first real voyage to the pole originated from Pearl Harbor. Bill wanted to prove that you could navigate from one hemisphere to the other underneath the polar ice pack. He felt that from the west side was the way to go. The whole plan ran into some issues early on. They had a fire aboard Nautilus on the way. It was primarily an oil fire and some insulation. It was a very stubborn, a very smoky fire, and they did have to surface in order to vent smoke. And it certainly occurred to Captain Anderson that if that happened while they were under the polar ice, it would be a fatal catastrophe. They also had a leak in the freshwater system that they could not find the leak. They were unable to get it stopped. They conveniently did not tell Admiral Rickover about the fire. They deliberately did not tell Admiral Rickover about the leak. But when they got to Seattle, to Bremerton, he sent a bunch of crew members to auto supply stores all over the Seattle area, and they bought up all the radiator stop leak they could find, and they used that, and it worked. They were able to stop the water leak. Speaking of Rickover, he was not a fan of this plan. Not only are you risking the most famous ship in the world with Nautilus, and they had done 2 years worth of PR to establish the fact that Nautilus was such a fantastic vessel, but the lives of 105 men. And Rickover knew that if the worst happened, if they lost the ship, or if the mission simply failed and somehow it became common knowledge that it had failed, it would only contribute not only to that perception that the Russians were winning the technology battle, but it would also throw a real kink into the nuclear Navy program. And there were still a lot of people in the Navy that were not necessarily big fans of so much dedication and so much money going into the nuclear Navy. My first question to Bill, and he was very adamant about it, why did he choose to go from the Pacific side to the Atlantic side? Bill admitted that actually going to the North Pole on the Greenland side was relatively easy unless you ran into unexpected ice or unexpectedly shallow water, because most of that route we were reasonably sure was deep. He wanted to do the hardest thing first. That, of course, was right down Admiral Rickover's alley. I always wondered why he chose to make the first nuclear vessel a submarine. He wanted to tackle the hardest problem first. And that's what Bill wanted to do. In order to make this work, he wanted to take the toughest route first. Plus, he didn't want to get through the North Pole and then not be able to get back through the Bering Strait and have to turn around and go back through Greenland. That would completely negate his theory that they would be able to go from one hemisphere to the other beneath the polar ice. We've already talked about the navigation issues, and they were well aware of that. He was also well aware that the Chukchi Sea was very shallow. I mean, we've had eons of ice flow and ice breaking off and bringing silt and mud and dirt out into the Chukchi Sea. It's just not very deep. For a submarine to remain submerged all the way through was going to be a tough thing. And sure enough, once into the Chukchi Sea, they ran into an issue. They got lost under the ice again. There was, at one point, they passed beneath an ice keel, and Captain Anderson was very sure that they had less than a foot clearance from the sail to the bottom of that ice keel. Bill compared going through the polar ice while submerged as driving down a hallway in a house you've never been in before without lights at 35 miles an hour without hitting the walls. Maybe a little exaggeration, but not much. So that first attempt in June of 1958 failed. Bill was very much concerned that that would be the last effort, that nobody would want them to try it again because it had been so dangerous. So back to Pearl Harbor, back to the big fireboat, welcome to Pearl and all that sort of thing. Bill went back to work, assuming that they would be denied, but just in case they did have a chance to take another run at the North Pole. He did a lot of studying of the data. They actually conducted ice observations by flying over the ice flow off Alaska, the Bering Strait, over the Arctic Ocean and the Chukchi Sea. And they tried some experimental work with navigational gear that was designed for missiles. And they felt like it would be a lot more accurate than any navigational gear that they had had in the past. And sure enough, they got the okay to give it another try. The assault on the North Pole started late July, early August 1958. The hull number was painted over because total secrecy was absolutely of utmost importance for two reasons. We didn't want the Russians to know what we were up to. We did not want the Russians to see Nautilus out there. Again, the most famous ship in the world. Her profile was unique. They certainly would have known who she was and would have guessed what she was up to. And we didn't want our own folks to know it, because with a hull number painted over and a mysterious vessel in a place that nobody thinks she's supposed to be, that could also be dangerous. We might have attacked her, who knows? But certainly a lot of people would have found out what was up, what we were attempting to do. Left Pearl Harbor, headed for the North Pole. And we joked as we were doing the book, and when we were pitching the book, the publisher made note of the fact that, you know what, the most exciting part of this thing takes place in the first half of the book. What are you going to do in the second half of the book? Well, we had to sort of address that issue as we told the story. But once they got into the Arctic Ocean, which is very deep, and again, we had reason to believe that the Arctic Ocean was relatively deep and they could certainly proceed beneath the ice and at a depth that would be safe without running into a mountain or a hillock. And sure enough, they did. And on August 3rd, 1958, 11:15 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, they reached the North Pole. Santa even came by to welcome them to his neighborhood and wish them Godspeed on the rest of the trip. Bill got on the 1MC and made the announcement as they passed through the pole for the USA and the US Navy, the North Pole. They didn't stop and try to plant a flag. That would not have been prudent. They had no way to surface unless they happened to find a hole in the ice. There are very little holes in the ice there. And in the process, they became the first vessel to reach the North Pole. Doesn't sound like such a big deal today. It was a big deal in 1958. And notice the use of Eastern Standard Time, by the way. At that latitude, you're literally going through a different time zone every 3 or 4 minutes. And Bill decided to keep all logs and all communication on Eastern Standard Time. That's the route. This is a souvenir map that was drawn up and presented to a lot of people that were associated with the voyage. The tough part, once they got past the Chukchi Sea and the Arctic Ocean and got into the deeper part of the Arctic Ocean, it wasn't a given, but they were pretty much on the way. And of course, they had to be extra sure that they had actually passed through. There have been other explorers prior to Nautilus who had claimed to reach the North Pole on the ice pack, and they didn't really. Visit by Santa came August 3rd, 1958. When they got to just off Greenland, and they were finally able to surface reliably and safely, they started making the call and sent the message Nautilus 90 North, which would indicate that they had reached the 90th latitude, which is the North Pole, and that they had done so safely and emerged on the other side. The only problem is nobody received their message. Nobody was hearing the message. They kept calling. They kept calling. Those of us who fool with radio, I'm a ham radio operator, and I know how unreliable propagation is at those latitudes. I'm not at all surprised. But finally, a guy came back to them and acknowledged receipt. That radio operator was in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. That was the first one to hear the call of Nautilus 90 North. On the 50th anniversary, I had a chance to put on the air a special event amateur radio station from Groton there in the parking lot next to Nautilus. And we talked to ham radio operators all over the world, allowed them to make contact with us in celebration of the event, commemoration of it. And one of the people we talked to that day was that radioman from Pearl Harbor who had received the message 50 years before. And we talked to him at almost exactly the same time that he had received the message. That was a thrill. We did most of our communication on single sideband voice for the special event station, but we switched over to Morse code to make that contact with the fellow who had received the first message. That was a thrill. Once they were back underway again, they were headed for Portland, England, but as soon as the Navy could, they came and picked Captain Anderson up off Nautilus and hustled him back to the White House, because the one thing President Eisenhower wanted to do was make sure he got maximum PR advantage out of what this submarine had been able to accomplish. The White House press conference, Bill said he was so sleepy, so tired, so just worn out, because he was the tension of this whole thing had been building on him for most of a year, but he still managed to stand up and talk to the press. He received the Legion of Merit there at the top left. He pointed out to the press the rough course that Nautilus had done across the top of the world, and then the Nautilus itself, the crew received the Presidential Unit Citation. When I tell people, again, in pitching the book even, how important and what a big deal this was, it was roughly equivalent in excitement and coverage to the moon landing. People scoff. No, it wasn't. It was huge. It was a huge deal. Here's the some images from one of the first stops when they got back to the U.S. in New York City. Up at the upper left there, that's an iceberg, or a piece of ice that they had actually picked up off the deck of Nautilus after they had surfaced, and they were coming to pick up Captain Anderson, of course, Admiral Rickover there too. Over on the right, the fireboat welcome as they go up, in this case, the Hudson River. It was a rainy, dreary, stormy day when they made this run, but still people were filling the windows all along the Hudson River. People were lined up along the streets to see Nautilus. Over on the left is a ticker tape parade down Broadway. If you're in New York, go to Lower Broadway. If you go to McDonald's and stand right on the sidewalk in front of McDonald's, you'll see the star in the sidewalk there that commemorates the ticker tape parade for the USS Nautilus. And if you don't think it was a big deal, Bill made the cover of Life magazine. I show that to people today and they say, what is this Life? What is a magazine exactly? To make the cover of Life was a certain indication of how big a deal this was. And Bill had a 12-page spread in Life magazine. I was going to bring my copy in and show you in person too. I've got a copy that my daughter-in-law found in Portland, Oregon, of all places, in a used bookstore. Big deal. It was a big deal for a number of points. First of all, it certainly was a poke in the eye to the Russians. We showed them that we were ahead technologically, at least when it came to the nuclear navy, and that now and from now on, we would have the capability of operating beneath the ice in the Russian backyard. It also very well demonstrated what the nuclear submarine could accomplish, that it was now possible, because Nautilus had done it, to go from one hemisphere to the other and not have to go through the Panama Canal to get there, or around the south of Africa or the south of South America. That was a big deal. And it sent a strong message to the navies all across the world. Also showed a lot of other capabilities of the nuclear submarine. I didn't mention this when I was talking about the sea trials for Nautilus. You know, she could go 20 knots submerged, 22 knots on the surface, so practically as fast submerged as she was on the surface, which took a lot of work on a periscope that would allow you to have the scope up and be running along at 20 knots at that time. But Bill talked a lot about the how remarkable it was for boat captains on Long Island Sound to report a rooster tail with no sign of any vessel making the rooster tail. That was the periscope of Nautilus. This also showed all the other capabilities of the nuclear submarine, as I mentioned. Completely changed the face of warfare in a very basic way. We don't mention enough about, I don't think, the scientific and oceanographic data that Nautilus was able to compile, and that other vessels that followed her to the North Pole were able to do. And it also showed the world that American technology was still powerful. But as I have to point out to Bill, I told him many times, this also gave America the heroes that we so desperately needed at that time in the 1950s. Bill did not consider himself to be a hero. Captain William Anderson is one of the most modest men I have ever met in my life. Many of you may have known him. He almost didn't do this book because he didn't want people to think that he was claiming credit for himself, or he was trying to shine the light on himself. He wanted everybody from the crew to the scientific community that helped, to the men and women at Electric Boat in Groton that helped build that submarine, to get the credit for the voyage, and not necessarily Captain Bill Anderson. Today, the Nautilus that was decommissioned in March of 1980, people also forget, by the way, that she served her country for almost 26 years, so obviously well past the warranty. Today, the Nautilus is a museum ship at Submarine Force Museum and Library in Groton, Connecticut. You guys know where that is. It is one of only 2 vessels that has been designated by Congress as historic naval ships. Guess what the other one is? I see lips moving, but it's Old Ironsides, USS Constitution in Boston. And by the way, if you go there, if you haven't been to the Subforce Museum, go take a look at Nautilus. They've done a great job in making her available and visible for people who have no idea what this ship did. Hopefully, after they've been aboard, they get some idea of the importance of the vessel. The admission is free, costs nothing. Just don't ask to see the reactor. They'll give you that funny look. That obviously is the most asked question, especially by other submariners. Can we go down and take a look at the reactor? Reactor hasn't been there forever, but they still say that's sensitive area, and no, we cannot go to the reactor compartment. The advertising portion of my talk, I've had the honor of writing, let's say, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 nonfiction books about submarines, primarily World War II. Gallant Lady tells the story of the USS Archer Fish, which sank the biggest ship that's ever been sunk by a submarine, the Shinano aircraft carrier. She was supposed to have been the 3rd sister battleship. The Japanese finally realized that they needed carriers far worse than they needed dreadnoughts. She was coming out of Tokyo Bay on her maiden voyage. The folks on Archerfish were doing lifeguard duty. They saw her on the radar. They thought it was an island. Radar operator said, "Captain, your island is moving." She looked funny. They had canted the stacks because they originally were designed to be on a battleship. They wanted the smoke to move away from the flight deck. Anyway, she was on the way to the inland sea to get her complement of aircraft and head to the Philippines. Archerfish somehow managed to sink an unsinkable aircraft carrier. In the course of duty tells the story of the USS Batfish. The Batfish is called the submarine killer submarine. She sank 3 I-boats in a little over 3 days. Considering our submarines in World War II only sank 7 I-boats, she got almost half of them in 3 days. Right place, right time. Theoretically, these I-boats were on the way back to Tokyo Bay from the Philippines, loaded with officers, civilians, mistresses, and gold. But Batfish sank all 3. After the third submarine had been sunk, the captain got on the 1MC and made a little speech, and he talked about how it was disturbing to take the lives of fellow submariners, but they did what they did in the course of their duty. And the Japanese would, of course, have done the same thing. That little section was what Captain William Anderson read in the course of duty, and that's what spurred him to give me a call to help him write the Ice Diaries. Final Patrol talks about the Batfish and 16 other World War II submarines that are open to the public as museum ships. Did you know we had 17 World War II submarines that you can visit? Not quite true anymore. A couple of them are in trouble. The Ling in Hackensack, New Jersey is no longer open. The Clamagore in Charleston is on the verge of not being open. She's going to be a fish reef, I'm afraid. And that's a sad situation. I've known several groups who have looked at the possibility of salvaging her and pulling her somewhere else, but very, very expensive proposition. I'm afraid we're going to lose her. Of those 17 World War II boats, 16 are U.S. boats. There's 1 German U-boat. The one in Chicago, Museum of Science and Industry. If you haven't had a chance to go see her, they've done a remarkable thing with her too. Undersea Warrior is the biography of Mush Morton, one of the true innovators in World War II submarine history. When we started that war, we didn't have a single submarine captain who had ever fired a torpedo in anger. We literally had to learn submarine warfare on the fly. We had, thankfully, some of the most advanced war machinery in history with the Gato and Baleo class submarines. It took Mush Morton and Red Ramage and Dick O'Kane and some of those guys to figure out how to use them to their maximum advantage. Mush Morton certainly was one of those. And War Beneath the Waves, I had to really walk a fine line with that particular book because it tells the story of the USS Billfish in the Macassar Strait came under a depth charge attack, and they steamed for 12 hours, continually being pounded by depth charges. A young junior officer, a guy named Charlie Rush, was the diving officer, and when he was finally relieved, he went up to the conning tower to see if he could help up there. He found the captain on his knees in the corner, crying and praying and ordering them to surrender the submarine. He called a corpsman up to take the captain back to his stateroom and sedate him. Charlie made the call that was basically mutiny. He said, "I have the con." He took over the boat, found out they'd been steaming a straight line for 12 hours, that they probably were leaking air or oil bubbles. He did a button hook turn, came back under their own oil slick and saved the boat. Fantastic story. I actually heard that story on the way to Captain Anderson's funeral at Arlington National Cemetery from another submariner. And that's when I decided to do that book. George and I have done this batch of books, and we're awfully proud of those. I turn to submarines because I'm a storyteller, and there's some great stories among submariners, as you guys know. Some of them are even true. But George and I go and make up these stories just to make sure we never run out. I have run around on the submariners a little bit. I've gone behind their back. I wrote a book about an oiler of all things. The oiler at the Battle of the Coral Sea that was set 100 miles south so she wouldn't be lost. The fleet admiral was very concerned about losing an oiler. He felt like he had to have that fuel. He did, for his aircraft as well as his carriers. Sent her 100 miles south. The Japanese mistook her for one of our carriers and sent everything they had from their carrier fleet down to try to sink that aircraft. Oh, I'm sorry, the oiler. The other book, The Indestructible Man, is the story of Dixie Kiefer, who was the XO on the Yorktown at the Battle of the Coral Sea and also Midway. He was the last guy off the Midway the second time. They abandoned ship after the big battle, thinking the Midway was sinking. They get up the next day and she's still afloat. They're going to try to tow her back to Pearl Harbor and put her back in service. Dixie Kiefer was the XO. He led the party back to try to salvage and get her ready to tow. That's when the I-boat snuck through the screen and was able to attack Yorktown and sink her for sure this time. Dixie Kiefer should have gotten the Medal of Honor for what he did that day. He was the last guy off. He burned his hands and broke his ankle on the way off the ship, and yet he still pushed a life raft full of wounded men a great distance to the rescue ship. One of the books I've got coming out this spring is Only the Brave, which takes a look at the Battle of Guam. It's one of those battles most of us are not even aware of. I certainly wasn't, as much World War II history as I've done. Extremely important battle. The whole Marianas campaign was, because we wanted a platform to start doing bombing runs on Tokyo and Japan, the home islands, and we were able to do that once we captured Tinian, Guam, and Saipan. And from there, we launched all those bombing runs, and that helped eventually end the war. Of course, the one particular airplane that took off from Tinian did end the war. That was the Enola Gay, and dropped the atomic bomb, and so did the second atomic bomb come from Tinian. All right, that's it. Thank you all for listening, and I'll appreciate it very much.
Anybody has any questions, feel free to chime in either on chat or if we can do it one at a time, we can do it voice.
Don, this is Tim Oliver. And got a question. If you ever ran into Bob McWethy, who'd done all the Arctic investigations and helped advise Captain Anderson.
I did not. I've met several other folks along the way. Charlie Rush, for example, helped Captain Anderson with some of the preparations for the voyage. But and you also have to, as you ask questions, remember, we wrote this book 13 years ago. And I am now beyond senile, but I'll try to answer anything I can.
Other questions?
Hey, Don, Paul Segrist here. I don't have a question, just wanted to say thank you. I unfortunately didn't get into the boats until the 80s, but this was a chapter that I'd only read a bit about in history, and I appreciate you putting it all down. I'm looking forward to reading it. Thanks, sir.
Well, thank you very much. I love these stories. Again, I'm a storyteller. That's what I do. And man, do we have a lot of stories to tell about the silent service. I mentioned the Medal of Honor, by the way. Are you aware that only 8 submariners have received the Medal of Honor? 8 submariners. I've tried to rectify that. I would love to get the Medal of Honor for Mush Morton. There are very specific reasons why I know that he did not get the Medal of Honor. I would love to get it for Captain William Anderson. I'd like to get it for Charlie Rush. It's hard to do that.
Don, John Lindstedt here. When Captain Anderson was decorated by Eisenhower in the White House, Rickover was not present. And in the Rickover movie, they talked that he made a special visit to thank the Admiral. Do you have any input on that? What was said or how he felt?
I don't, nothing that I recall. If you notice, one of the pictures I showed was with the big piece of ice on the tray. That was actually before they got to New York City. And that was after the White House, but before the New York City event. Rickover did come aboard Nautilus and congratulate Bill. I know he told this, Rickover said this to a lot of people, but Bill remembered it and he took it to heart. He said, Bill, go ahead and do this run if you want to. I'm the engineer. You're the operator. You make the decision on what you want to do with your ship. And that was, I thought, a remarkable revelation of the kind of man Rickover was.
Don, this is Dick Brown. And one key player you didn't mention is the navigator, Lieutenant Shep Jenks. Shep was a real good friend of mine, and in fact, he was on my USS New Mexico commissioning committee. And in the submarine review, I wrote an article about the run up to North Pole, and I had just enough time before Shep died that he was able to review this article and gave me a little bit more information to put in there. So I just thought I'd mention that. Thank you very much. This was a very interesting presentation. Thanks
Yeah,
a lot, Don.
I had a chance to visit a couple of times with Shep. One of those, unfortunately, was at Captain Anderson's funeral at Arlington.
Hey, Don, this is Ted Hack. Just a comment. One of the junior officers on board Nautilus during the ice trip was, I think he was RC or IC division officer, I'm not sure, John West Harvey, who eventually became the CEO of the Thresher when it went down. And I didn't know him at the time. He was actually the uncle of my first wife. And his widow gave me his dolphins that he, excuse me, hadn't taken to sea that weekend that the Thresher went down. And they're back now on active duty, being presented every year to the most junior officer qualified in submarines at one of the submarine birthday balls. But he was on that trip, and my wife had several cachets that they distributed after that trip to the North Pole, Nautilus 90 North in the corner. And a real amazing man. I wish I had met him, but I didn't know him.
Well, as you guys know, the submarine community is a very small group among all the people in the Navy. I don't remember his name, and I wouldn't give it if I did, but one of the men who made the North Pole run was also a crewman on Thresher, but his wife got sick the day before they left on that trip, and the captain said, just stay home with your wife. We'll be back in a couple of days anyway. And he did. He obviously has survived, and as so many people did who lost the boat without them aboard, he had a very difficult time after that. He felt very guilty about not being with his shipmates on that voyage.
Don, you haven't mentioned your movie.
Which one?
Which one? Well, they know the one, but the color of character.
Yeah, Colors of Character is a movie that I wrote and produced. I've got a little film company that I fool around with. And it tells the story of a young man who grew up here in the Birmingham, Alabama area during the Civil Rights era. Had a tough time. He had family problems. He had drug issues. He dreamed of becoming an artist. And everybody would tell him that you're a black man, you'll never make a living as an artist. And he, because of that frustration, turned eventually to the gang lifestyle. He was a drug enforcer for the Crips, which is about as bad as you can get. He doesn't tell me that he killed anybody, but it wouldn't surprise me. Statute of limitations doesn't run out on murder, so I don't think he would admit to it. But he was dared to go to church one night. He went to church. He had the complete religious conversion during that church service, turned his life around. He's now one of the most honored artists working. He started doing Christian and inspirational art. He turned to sports art. He's painted just about every big name sports star you can think of. And then one day he says God told him he wasn't going to do the sports art anymore. He needed to start commemorating the civil rights movement and some of the personalities from that. Even though it was a terrible financial move for him, he turned to that, and now he's getting accolades for some of the work he's done in that area. We decided to do his story, and we did a movie called Colors of Character. And that is now available for premium video on demand. It costs you $20, but you can go make all your neighbors chip in $1 or $2 and pay for it. And you can watch it on your computer or television if you got a smart TV. It'll be available until January 31st. You can go to colorsofcharactermovie.com. Colors is plural. Colorsofcharactermovie.com. Or if you go to my website, donkeith.com, you can see the link to the movie there. It's a big, man, do we need this kind of movie right now. It's inspiring. This man overcame some amazing things to be as successful as he is. I think we did a pretty good job producing it too, if I do say so myself.
Well, Penny and I made a special trip down to Fredericksburg to watch it, and it's an amazing movie. It's well worth the time to sit there and watch it. And very inspirational.
Don, do you know if Nautilus had any special ice detection sonar or small object locator? I know we did later on, but I don't
Nope.
know whether they had anything at that time.
Nope. They used everything that was on your typical submarine at that time to try to look ahead to see what ice was coming up. But no, nothing special at all. Not even on the third run.
Don, this is Ginger Haskell. I grew up in Birmingham, and I just want to tell you there's a saying that in the South, the point of a story is the story. And I want to thank you and George for telling such fabulous stories.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. When were you in Birmingham?
I grew up there from 1950 to 1970 something.
What radio station did you listen to?
Yeah, Ginger.
Pardon?
What radio
Where did you
station?
get your degree from?
Oh, my degree is from the University of Alabama, my last one, yes.
Roll Tide, Roll Tide.
There you go. There you go.
If you listen to radio in the 70s, you heard me. I was on a couple of radio stations here as a disc jockey.
Oh, at that time I was working for a radio station in Memphis, Tennessee.
Oh.
WMPS and WKRC.
Know them well.
There you go.
But I appreciate your comments, by the way. I do a lot of writer workshops and that kind of thing. And the first thing I say is, don't write, tell the story. Don't let your writing get in the way of the story. So many people forget
That's right.
one little thing.
Okay. Other questions?
Well, I'd like to thank Don for this presentation. I never got to go under the ice. I missed it by this much when I got off Hawkbill right before the 3 637s went up there in the early 80s. I'd also like to thank George for inviting other chapters. I see several people from the Pacific Northwest chapter. I'm in the Pacific Northwest chapter, but I'm in Richmond, Virginia right now. And on the chat, we have our chapter meeting in a couple hours, 18:30 Eastern time. And we're happy to have Admiral Doug Perry, Submarine Group 9, going to talk about the submarine force and his experiences over this unique last year. So if you look on chat, you'll see the link to that. You can also find it on our Facebook page, or send him a note, he'll get it to you. So thanks a lot to Don and George.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you. Sorry, I have one question and 1 point, if that's acceptable.
Certainly.
So you mentioned Rickover. Most of us are sort of fortunate enough to read about him. How much of it is fact and how much of it is fiction, the interview process?
Talking to a bunch of people who went through those interviews, it's all true.
I believe every story I've ever heard.
Oh yeah.
Was throwing the submarine floor, the submarine model on the floor, did that happen?
Most likely.
I'm sure.
Yeah, and one.
You know, the amazing thing to me is he got himself named head of the nuclear reactor branch for the Navy and also head of the Atomic Energy Commission, so he could write himself a memo telling himself to do something and approving that. It's amazing. He knew how to play the political game. Thank goodness he didn't stay in Russia. That's where he was born.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Tim, this is Dave Hemming. Do you know, was it you or do you know the person that had to stand on the chair and sing for the Admiral at the interview?
I don't, but with all the talent in the submarine force, I'm sure there were many candidates who were worthy.
Yeah.
Did he actually lock somebody in a closet?
Oh, absolutely.
Oh yeah.
That was a standard thing that happened to lots and lots of people.
Oh, my favorite story that Bill told, besides the interview, when he finally got the job, he moved down to Washington, D.C. He goes to work the first day, and the Admiral says, "Welcome aboard. That's your office right over there." went over and Bill sat down. He had no idea what he was supposed to do. Nobody had told him what his job was. He went ahead and started, he felt that nuclear submarines were definitely on the way, obviously. And he started building the curriculum for training for nuclear commanding officers. And that's what he was working on. But finally, after a month, he walked into the Admiral's office and said, "Admiral, what is my job here exactly?" And Rickover looked at him and said, "Well, Anderson, what do you think your job is?" And that's when Bill told him what he had been working on. And he said, "That's it, go to work." A month later.
Did he forget? Did he forget that he'd lost?
I'm going to say all you old nukes I know have met Admiral Rickover, but how many of you have had dinner with Mrs. Rickover?
A lot of us.
Actually, she lives down the street from me in Arlington, Virginia.
Very nice lady. Yeah.
See her all the time at the giant supermarket.
Okay, sorry. The point I was going to make, Don, you said it.
Good evening, Mrs. Rickover.
Sorry, sorry, Don. The point that you made, you said that now it's not a big deal to many people. Well, to some of us, it's still a massive deal. And last time I was fortunate enough to ask a question and make some points, I ended by thanking everyone. And again, thank you very much, particularly Don. Excellent presentation. And I certainly have learned a lot. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks everybody for attending. If Tim remembered to hit the record button, which hopefully that happened, this will be up on our website in a couple of days so that you can go back and enjoy it again. Or if somebody missed it, they can obviously go back and watch it. So
Tim couldn't hear you through all that hair.
thank you, Don, for a great presentation.
Sorry, Tim.
And the best of the holidays to everybody. Stay
Thanks,
safe.
Don.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much.